Thank you, everybody, for joining part 4 of our 6-part live panel series on selling MDM to leadership. So really not much in terms of master data management technology here, much more about the organizational dynamics of how you kick off a program, how you justify the program. And in today's session, we're going to be talking about how you pick the right scope. Last week, we covered, broadly speaking, organizational readiness. How do you know if you're ready to tackle an MDM project, or your organization really is ready to tackle one? Then getting into the justification, prioritization, and right sizing of the project. We talked on Thursday about total cost of ownership, some of the things that drive total cost of ownership that are important to consider when you're looking at the ROI. And today we're going to be talking about program scope. We'll get into that obviously in just a second. Tomorrow we're talking about evaluation pitfalls, which I think will be interesting to anybody who's considering selecting a master data management program or on a piece of software to fulfill the program. You'll hear from some people who've been on the other side of the evaluations and where we start to see things going right or going wrong from an evaluation perspective. And then on Thursday this week, we will talk about how to get beyond the first use case and the value of going beyond the first MDM use case. One of the things that I think is kind of special about Profisee's approach is that we view the first domain as only as the first step in a series, and we find that that's where when you go beyond the first use case is where the value really starts to ramp up. So interesting conversations for this week, and today is around program scope, how to establish quick wins and select the right initial scope in order to build the right program. So instead of last week, we had people introduce themselves, then I introduced them. Today I'm going to ask random people to introduce somebody else. So Christopher, could you introduce Bill? Just
Absolutely. So I'm pleased to be joined by Bill O'Kane again today. Bill has been part of Profisee now for just over a year. Prior to that, Bill was the lead analyst for Gartner around master data management, and was the lead author on the Magic Quadrant for quite a few of his years there. He was at Gartner for 8 years. Was also pivotal to creating the Magic Quadrant as we know it today. If you've been in this market for a while, you may recall there used to be 2 quadrants, one MDM quadrant for product, a different quadrant for customer. And Bill was in charge of formulating the combined MDM quadrant several years back. In his time at Gartner, Bill engaged with around 3,000 different organizations and really focused on how to make them successful with an MDM program, how to evaluate vendors. So he's got tremendous experience in this space, and we're delighted to have him part of Profisee. His MDM experience precedes Gartner. He was pivotal in creating some of the early MDM technology back in the day at a large life insurance organization that went on to become DWL and eventually IBM MDM Advanced Edition. So quite a long background in this space. We're pleased to have his expertise.
Excellent, Christopher. Now, I'll point out that was all done without notes because I didn't tell these guys I was going to do this. All right, Harbert, can you introduce Christopher?
Christopher, absolutely. He's our VP of Customer Success. He's was part of a startup and founder of a startup that was at the very beginning stages of what is master data management. He's also worked for some of our competitors, and we're lucky to have Christopher here at Profisee. He has at least 20 plus more years of experience in this space. And I'd personally like to say, I don't think there's anyone that has a more innovative perspective on what MDM can do for enterprises and how MDM can transform enterprises at the highest level. A true subject matter expert.
Excellent. And then for symmetry, Bill, can you introduce Harbert?
Sure, glad to do it. Harbert Bernard runs the Global Value Consulting team here at Profisee. You've heard us mention a couple of times in here something we call the Business Impact Roadmap, or BIR or BEER. That's the latest and greatest incarnation of a framework that we have that helps folks zero in on the valuable outcomes that they can get from MDM and what order to pursue them in and how to get agreement that that's what's going to deliver that kind of benefit to them. And so in that role, he's invaluable. He's got a lot of experience around this. He's very much a finance geek, which is a good thing in this role. So those of you that have heard a reference to beer, that's Harbert's baby, and he does a great job driving that through with a lot of our clients and prospects. He's done similar things at other places on a consulting and employment basis. I'm going to say going back at least 8 or 10 years, if not longer. And he's certainly an expert in the finance side and the implementation side of MDM.
Excellent, thank you. And I'm your moderator, VP Product Marketing, Martin Boyd. So we'll just take it from there. Thank you, guys. Now, we're going to here talk about the program scope. The important thing to recognize around, when you're thinking about overall program scope, not all data has the same value, not all data problems have the same impact. We're going to talk about different ways to kind of uncover where the most value is and which ones are going to have the most quick impact. One of the things I think we all understand when we're dealing with enterprise implementations is that you need to, these days you can't wait for 2 years for an implementation because the world has moved on by the time you get done. So you need to get quick wins and you need to start building what I call the enthusiasm flywheel. The first step builds some enthusiasm and excitement. People start to get interested. People start to want to be involved. And you kind of build the program from there. And as I mentioned a moment earlier, one of the things that's special about Profisee is that it's very easy to move from the first to the second to the third domain, product data domain, or rather master data domain, and to first to the second to the third use case. These things build on each other. And what we typically see when things are going well is that other people in the organization start coming to you who've now becoming a center of expertise, start asking to be part of it, and could you do that with my data, etc. But it's important then, it's even more important then that you get the right first starting point. You don't attempt to boil the ocean. You don't do something that's too obscure that no one really cares about. You have to do something that people care about, yet is tractable and can deliver short-term success. So that's really what we're going to spend some time talking about here. And I guess because we're saying start small, we've got these cute little dogs to help us along the way, something to look at while we're talking. All right, so I'm going to ask Christopher to lead off and talk a little about the whole idea of starting small and quick wins, what might be easier use cases versus harder use cases, and just some hard-won experience and rules of thumb in that area.
Excellent. Well, hey, thank you, Martin. And I'll certainly rely on my colleagues to chime in. The first thing is, we talked about this, you can see it in the title, is program scope, right? One of the most important things when you're talking about data management to your organization and to leaders is to make sure you're setting the notion correctly that data management is a program, right? It's not like implementing a CRM where there's a finite start and finish. Taking on data management is going to be a longer term program. And even if you only do data management around a certain subset of data, there will be ongoing curation and ongoing work. So the first thing to understand is that this is not a project with a start and finish. Perhaps implementing a technology may have a start and then a go live, but data management is a living, breathing program within the organization. So part of what we've talked about throughout this, and we'll continue to talk this week, is making sure that the organization understands that there is a program, that there's ongoing effort to managing your data, which does mean you've got to be able to show value in that effort. Right? So that's why this initial phase or initial scope becomes so important, because if you don't actually deliver something quickly that does have tangible value, the willingness of the organization to do that ongoing investment will start to fade out and diminish over time. And so in my experience, I know Bill, in our conversations and your experience, we've seen several MDM initiatives effectively wither on the vine. And it's because they didn't get the right scope and they didn't tie it to some kind of business outcome. So we talk about start small And I have this vision of everybody on the call today saying, all right, Captain Obvious, this is everybody knows you're supposed to start small. We've heard this over and over. It's all about quick wins and agile approaches versus an old school waterfall approach. But why are we talking about that again here? It's because with master data management, choosing the right scope is sometimes more difficult. You're talking about a flexible data management platform, not a discrete business application that performs a specific function. So choosing scope with an MDM program is quite a bit harder than some other technologies. That's particularly true when you have an MDM platform that is multi-domain. You know, with a solution like Profisee or some of the other solutions on the market, you could start with customer, or you could start with contact, or you could start with material, finished good, or facility. You know, the list goes on and on and on. So it's not always obvious to figure out where to start small. So we're not going to sit here today and preach to you about why you should start small, because I think that's just widely known. You should always, whenever you take on any kind of technology initiative, you want to start small and build incrementally. Our focus today is going to be what are some of the nuances to choosing the right scope for starting an MDM. So that'll be kind of the key part of the conversation across the different subjects we've got lined up for you today. The first biggest thing that is critical is the slide that Martin brought up before. It's important that you and your organization understand and can agree that not all data has the same value. Right? I get really nervous when I engage with organizations and they say, hey, we need to clean up our data. It's a big mess. And I say, well, what data do you need to clean up? And they say, all of it. It's a mess everywhere. Well, again, some data that is messy may have impacts on the organization that are minor grievances. Other data could have critical impacts, right? So the first thing to understand and to make sure that leadership understands is not all data within an organization has the same value, or data discrepancies, data issues, data problems may or may not have different levels of impact. So you've got to make sure that you're thinking about where can I find a scope that is doable within a reasonable time frame, but where there is actually some kind of tangible impact. And you're not taking on the cleansing and stewardship of data for the sake of data. Right? It's got to be for the sake of some kind of outcome. And we probably are starting to sound like a broken wheel in that regard. And we'll talk a little bit about how to figure that out. One of the other notions that I've seen is organizations like, hey, if I go live, if we go through phase one and we get to production and we've got data stewards, we can say we're successful. That's not necessarily the case, right? Just being able to stand up a technology and have some users in it. As I said, those kinds of initiatives, if you can't tie that effort and the ongoing stewardship and data curation to some kind of business outcome, those tend to wither on the vine. And in the long run, those projects are not deemed successful. Right? So successful is not go live. Successful is a sustained program where data management and the value of data is taken seriously, not just by the technology side of the organization, but by the entire organization.
Hey, Chris.
And then lastly, go ahead, Martin.
I was just going to ask, when you talk about quick wins, what kind of time frame do you think that would be? Is that weeks, months? I mean, what's your rule of thumb for that?
You want, it's a competing set of priorities. You want the shortest runway possible to something that's real. Right? So you can't do something that if you say the mandate is 6 weeks, but within 6 weeks I can't show any real results, you're probably going to have to take on more scope. What I've seen is many organizations are able to find something tangible if they're clever about thinking about the data issues and ways to slice and dice the program. Many organizations can find something where they're tangibly successful within 10 to 12 weeks. I think that's the sweet spot. I've seen a few use cases where it's a little bit shorter. I've seen some use cases where it's longer. I started to get seriously nervous when you start getting to 26 weeks, right? When you start to get to 2 quarters or more before you're able to show any tangible results, I think there's probably some risk there. And you should rethink, hey, how can we slice this apart a little further and decompose the problem a little further to still show value, but shorten that time frame. And
Excellent.
because because we're talking about data management in general, the process for doing that is going to be unique to every organization. So we'll give you some input and insights on things to consider, but it's going to be unique to your organization about how can you right-size this initial project to deliver something.
All right, let's get some other folks talking. Bill, can you talk a little bit about what types of projects are usually the ones where you can find the right trade-off between quick wins and sufficient value to matter?
Sure. I got a couple of things here. One is I'll just go back to something Christopher pointed out about program versus project. One of the rules of thumbs I gave a lot of people I interacted with over the years was, because I would often get the question, how long is this going to take me? When will it be over? Not just when can I deliver value, but when can I stop? When can I send all these consultants home? When I'm trying to budget, and I finally got frustrated at one point and said, and it became a rule of thumb. Every time you think about doing something, whether it's initiating, expanding, whatever it is, justifying your data management project, I want you to ask yourself if you would do the same thing to your procurement department, because that's how persistent this is going to be. If this is successful, it will last as long as your procurement function lasts, which is probably as long as you last as an organization. So again, take it as seriously as you take that. If you're thinking of offshoring something, ask yourself if you would offshore that, the corresponding part of your procurement function. If the culture says no, think about it, because there are some pretty good analogs there. In terms of quick wins, I would also say, and I'll use these two things as sort of a jumping off point. It varies, but Christopher touched on this a little bit there at the end. It varies by culture. I've worked in a lot of different industries, and I can almost tell you within an industry, what's the tolerance, for example, for over-promising and under-delivering versus under-promising and being a little underwhelming. If you work in healthcare, that's a completely different scenario than if you work in financial services. I spent part of my time as a professional program manager and project manager. And when I would start a new engagement or a new job, the first thing I would do is find somebody who knew and say, what's the big sin here? Is it being late? Is it spending too much money? Is it being underwhelming in terms of functionality you deliver? What is it that's going to make us successful here or make us a failure? There are big banks where if you're a week late on your project plan, it doesn't matter that you're $50,000 away from transforming the entire company. They'll stop you in your tracks. So again, quick win is also affected by that. And we're going to talk a little bit, maybe a definitions in order of the analytical versus operational. And there are some tendencies that people think are obvious. And as Christopher has said many times, very insightfully, it's not obvious. It's not always the thing that seems the easiest that will be the easiest, and hence our business impact roadmap as a technique to uncover that. So I'll just take a second and give you the book definitions and then sort of the real implications, which we'll get to a little later as well on the technical side. Analytical MDM is exactly what it sounds like. It's MDM solely or mostly in the service of analytics. So you're trying to get your data, your master data cleaned up for your analytics platforms, your data warehouses, your data marts, virtual or physical, however that tends to work out structurally. That's what it is. And there are ways to do that sometimes that don't involve MDM software. If you don't need real-time processing, if you never intend to go beyond that first use case, which is not a good thing, but it could be deliberate. We'll talk about that on Thursday. It might not be so important to you, but in particular, again, I'll toot Profisee's horn just a little, that at our TCO and price point, it becomes actually cost effective to use a tool like Profisee solely for analytical MDM. Again, it used to blow up my argument about whether MDM software is worth it at our price point. Operational MDM is also sort of what it sounds like. It's a little bit broader. It's MDM in service of business operations directly. So the most blatant example of it is you're sitting there with your MDM hub and surrounded by an enterprise service bus that's having it talk to all the business applications in real time, and you're doing check for duplicates before creates, which we'll get into at some point later. But there are more nuanced versions of it. So for example, most people, when you say operational MDM, think real time or near real time, whether it's pub sub, asynchronous, or synchronous request response, they think, oh, I'm sitting there, I'm getting stuff back right away, probably a record at a time. That's most of the time that's true. There's an affinity there. You're probably going to be correct most of the time, but there are cases of batch-oriented operational MDM and real-time oriented analytical MDM. So you should never think, I'm actually doing this, so I have to change everything if I go to do this. That's almost never the case. So there's the usual situations which cover 85% of the time, but don't think of them as empirical, because you will see exceptions, I can guarantee it, and mixtures, hybrids of the two. So again, analytical has implications. It's probably going to be batch. It's probably not going to be the system of record as MDM. The opposite's true for operational, but there are sort of middle grounds gray areas that can be covered as well. And we'll get to those on a technical basis in a few minutes. So, sorry, go ahead, Christopher.
No, go ahead.
I was going to say, Christopher's 12-week benchmark, I think, is pretty accurate. But again, and he did touch on this, you have to know your surroundings. Is it okay to be, I'll go back to that kind of obvious, Captain Obvious example. I'm 2 weeks away from finishing, but my plan said I'd be done today. What's that going to do to me in this organization? Should I plan ahead so that doesn't happen, or should I just spend most of my time making sure the solution will work if and when I get in there sometime around when I said I would? That can be a big differentiator in a lot of organizations. I worked in a lot of pharmas and healthcare, and they have a big tolerance for the IT framework tends to mirror the product framework, in that there's a lot of tolerance for deviation and exploration and things like that. In finance, again, it kind of mirrors the business culture, where you better be done when you said you'd be done, and don't spend any more than you said you would. Otherwise, you're going to be in a lot of trouble.
I was just going to ask Harbert a question, but it looks like he's dropped. Harbert, if you're there, just let me know. If you're not.
I'm still here. I've lost my internet connection thanks to the cable provider, but I still have my cell phone connection.
Okay. So the question I was about to ask you then, if you're able to answer, is when because you're often wrestling with program scope and looking at the ROI, how often does the program scope that someone comes to the table with end up being the one that they actually start with? Do they tend to pick something completely different, having done the full analysis with you, or do they expand it or contract it, having gone through that conversation? What, just as a normal experience, what do you find?
Very rarely does the initial program scope remain. Once you go through the analytical process to find out, where you're going to get your quick wins and where you're going to have the best use cases, usually the program scope changes. And we've even had multiple instances where someone has started with one domain, realized values in another domain, and switch the focus and prioritization of that use case. Also, a lot of value comes with multi-domains and bringing in reference data and attributes and things like that. So once you look at it from that perspective, scope does change regularly.
Yeah.
Okay,
I think
that's probably an interesting learning for everybody then, that the gut feel as to why you think you're going to get started on this after analysis most often isn't what you start with. Therefore, the analysis is important.
Yeah. It comes back to you need to start with the end in mind, right? There's two large mistaken notions that I encounter in the market over and over and over. And the first one is, hey, I'll select my program scope based upon analytical versus operational, as Bill was explaining. And typically, what I experience is organizations say, hey, we're going to start analytical and we're going to go operational. The misperception is that analytical will always be easier. The reality is there's sometimes operational solutions where it's centrally managing the process for onboarding suppliers that could have a much higher impact and a relatively low complexity. So you can't just say, hey, the way I'm going to figure out my scope is choose between analytical and operational, and word on the street is analytical. Don't make that assumption. The other thing that Harbert just touched on that I think is super important is the other big mistake I see is people say, well, I've selected a starting domain and therefore I've defined my scope. We're going to start with customer, B2B customer, or we're going to start with vendor. and they think that okay, I'm done. I've defined my scope. You really need to get more fine-grained than that, and decide, hey, which systems should be participating? Do I actually want to even manage all customers or a segment of customers? What are the data sources? There might be 10 data sources that have customer data, but in order to deliver value, how many of them do I actually need to bring together? Maybe it's just 2 or 3. So the 2 big mistakes I see is people say, well, I've chosen analytical versus operational, therefore I've limited my scope, and that's never enough. Or they say I've chosen a domain, therefore I've right-sized my scope, and generally that's never enough either. So you really do need to dig in deeper, which brings us back to the business impact roadmap. In order to make those choices, you must have done some analysis to figure out where are the data problems that deserve to be fixed first.
Yeah, thank you. So in the interest of time, let's pivot to the next topic, which is actually taking some of the same construct of analytical versus operational and going down to the next level. So I'm going to have Bill lead off on this. So buckle up, everybody. This is the Gartner analyst talking about implementation styles. Shall I put the next screen?
Is that me in the hat?
Yeah. Yeah, you decide.
Okay, so we're going to get a little bit architectural and technical here, but this usually is something everybody finds pretty helpful. I had 2 sort of life-changing conversations with a couple of prospects of Profisee last week that really took this to heart. I always assume people know this. It's a concept that Gartner has fostered. Other people have different versions of this. Some people say there are 3, some people say there are 5. Some people want to count hybrid, which we can pretty much do away with as the coexistence style. I won't take a ton of time on this. If anybody wants to follow up, I'll be more than happy to support that. These are the 4 physical implementation styles. Some people call them integration patterns or integration styles that MDM programs and solutions generally support. First thing, much like Christopher, I'm going to try to dispel a myth here, that you pick one and go for it, and that's the beginning and end of the story, and you've got your scope. The other one is that it has to be the same for every outcome you tackle, every domain within the outcome, and it won't change along that axis either. That's not true. And you'll see that that's that sort of blurb across the bottom. It's okay to have, in order to achieve an outcome, to have consolidated style customer data and centralized style product data at the same time, or vice versa. And it's okay, and what I'll spend a little bit of the rest of the time talking about is that sort of progression between styles for, let's say, a single outcome or a single domain, or domains to support that outcome. And again, to really hammer on what Christopher said there, someone saying they need to clean up their customer data, in my ears, is the same as saying I need to clean up all my data. In terms of risk and lack of definition and things like that. And again, that's what we're really looking to help with over these 2 weeks, is better definition of the objectives, and then right sizing for them and prioritizing them. In general, the 2 styles on the left have an affinity to, and again, it's not a 100%, but there's an affinity to the analytical MDM use case. Registry doesn't get used that much anymore outside of healthcare, where they still like it, because what registry basically is pointing to all your source data, but not storing copies of it. And that's appealing to a lot of people with sensitive data, because all they have to do is really point to where it's located, and wherever that is responsible for the security and privacy of it. It used to be very popular even outside of healthcare. It's lost its luster in the last decade, I would say, at least, for a couple of reasons. The main one being you don't ever really get good governance this way. It's hard to, for some reason, there's a difference when in the consolidated style you say, I'm going to start storing what I think the best email address is, and it's not yours, source system A owner. That tends to get people's attention. You don't have the best email address, so I'm not storing it as the best. That's different to them than saying, I'm just going to point to it. In fact, I'm going to point to all of them, and the consuming application can figure out what the best one is every time it needs to use it. So you can see why this might be less popular in a more automated MDM scenario. Consolidated is sort of the analytical scenario we described earlier. think of an ODS for a data warehouse that only stores master data, and you're going to be very close to what this is. In fact, there are many MDM hubs that function as ODSs for data warehouses, among other things. Again, usually that sort of next use case, the full value use case, tends to be on the right side, where we trust it so much that we start letting our applications integrate with it real time, whether it's read only or read write. And hence the two on the right side tend to have an affinity with what we refer to as operational MDM. They tend to be more live wired to your operations, your source systems, your admin systems. They still, again, will feed generally a data warehouse, and just moving from these doesn't mean you leave. They tend to be cumulative in a way. You don't leave consolidation style use cases behind because you move to coexistence. And again, I'll pick a domain. For B2C customer data, the consolidated style is very popular to start with. We talked about this earlier, but not always. And for things like product data or B2B customer or supplier that tend to have business processes supporting those functions already, if not optimal automation, they tend to start in centralized. I'm just going to load all the data in there, get control of it. And in a way, you can think of those things, centralized and consolidated, as sort of as polar opposites. In the consolidated style, you're kind of admitting, at least for now, that you're not going to get control of the entry of that data. It's always going to happen in those business apps. They're not going to have the data quality functions we need or the data integration functions we need. So we're going to do it in batch, and we're not going to write anything back to them. That's one of the things that differentiates consolidation style, is it doesn't write back to the source systems. In fact, the only updating it really does is matching and merging internally to itself. All the other interactions tend to be downstream, and that's why the arrows look like that. Coexistence starts to get a little mixed, where some attributes MDM is a system of record for and can write back to source systems, and centralized is really when it's doing it for all the master data in the domain. But in terms of quick wins, this is a way to look at it. I wrote a paper years back at Gartner on how to use these in that way, as sort of a palette, if you will, by outcome. Boy, what do I need? What's the least invasive thing I can do? So on the consolidation side, what makes that appealing is I'm not really asking any of my source systems to change. I'm sitting downstream from them. I'm very non-invasive, but I'm still able to implement all my data quality and business rules. I'm able to see how the performance is going for batch, if nothing else. Is this software what I thought it would be? All of that. Is my matching getting me to what I think is 100% data quality, or do I see a way to get there? So again, you're not really tying yourself, integrating tightly with those operational sources. So you're not, in a sense, putting the business at risk. In the coexistence and centralized styles, in the coexistence style, you really are, because those systems are really talking bi-directionally to each other, and you have to know your stuff to get there. Your semantic model's got to be good, and we'll get back to that in a bit. So that's how that has to work. In centralized, it actually is a little bit safer, because generally what this is used for is, I always use the example of new product introduction for manufacturing, right? You probably have a lot of systems and processes that handle designing and building and pricing and selling new products or distributing them. But there's probably a lot of slack between the nodes of that process. And often product MDM is brought in, or the product domain is brought in to just reduce that slack, manage the handover. In a sense, it's a BPM operation for product data. And so again, you can see that's the sort of polar opposite of trying to gather B2C customer data, but those two things are often orchestrated together at one time. So again, happy to dig into these more in another session if anybody would like. I do this with clients and prospects frequently, but this is the palette you're looking at. Is you're going left to right. It's less invasive, getting more invasive in terms of having the source systems, pieces of them having to be aware that MDM exists or not. The integration from left to right tends to go from batch to real time, but that's not 100% academic concept. You're going from being just a downstream system of reference often to being a system of record for some or all of your master data attributes. And again, there is, excuse me, an affinity between the ones on the left in analytics and the ones on the right in direct operations. Within this, I want to make the point Christopher touched on earlier about when we say not doing whole domains, what does that mean we should do? I'm a big believer in, it takes multiple domains to solve just about any real business outcome. that little blue drum in the middle should only contain the master data attributes you need to service the outcomes you've identified. You can always add more attributes later for your next internal release, for your next outcome, for your next business use case. That's one of the pitfalls, is that the things to watch out for is that scope just is bigger than you need. And again, you know, I said during a session last week, I believe in consulting, but you have to be careful. Everybody here, I bet, has seen a consulting statement of work that says, I want to come in and inventory all your data. Every single source system, I want to do a profile. We're going to figure out where the problems are. If you've been listening last week, you know that that is antithetical to everything we've been saying. You'd be better off pointing them at your future state instead of your current state and saying, you tell us what we should be doing based on what our competitors do or what the potential is. So again, that data model should be pretty narrow, especially for the first deliverable. If you've got something out there with, you know, 200, 300, 400 attributes, it's time to take a pause, because the idea that you're going to need all that to deliver value in 12 weeks, to use Christopher's guardrail, is just, you know, nonsensical.
Yeah. There's been a few questions coming in, and thank you everybody for doing that. And feel free to keep on dropping in the questions. Hopefully everybody is seeing that this framework here is a good way of having a conversation about how you're going to implement and exactly what you're going to implement and how it impacts scope, because you know, a one-way sync of data as opposed to a bidirectional is a very different thing from a scope and technology perspective. So a couple of questions just to sweep up. There is no real right or wrong and where to start, but this is a good conversation start for how are we going to pick. And it is absolutely possible. In fact, it's expected that you would evolve from one style to another as your implementation progresses. And that you could have different styles going on in different domains for different use cases. So hopefully that clarifies a little bit. Question, Bill, I'll let you pick this up. Is virtual MDM registry style? I'm not sure.
Yes.
Yeah. Okay.
That'll be my shortest answer for the 2 weeks. Every time I've seen it used, the answer would be yes.
Okay.
And I just don't really see it in the real world, right? Because the challenge you've got there is I've got pointers to every copy of this customer or this contact, but there's no way to know which of those systems has the right email or the most up-to-date email or the most up-to-date address. And so it just falls flat pretty fast. Right?
I think the original vision for this as a style was, I'm going to build a set of centralized services that know that actually, you know, and back to real life, every time I've seen that tried, that is a very noble goal, but every time I've seen it tried, eventually someone would come back and say, it was some statement like this: we've now decided to let the consuming applications house the business logic. What that means is we just punted. We're not going to try to build those services. You're all going to, and at that point, you're doing a data integration project. It's not even an MDM program anymore. And I would say, one other thing I would say, and I hope this isn't confusing, I usually leave it out, but the other three styles besides registry all usually contain registries. You know, so you may have a consolidated customer hub, but it's going to contain pointers to the products or services that customer used in whatever other system of record they have. Most real implementations have cross-references to other domains, wherever those domains may lie. So when we say registry here, we mean pure registry with nothing else in it. In a sense, you could say consolidated style is registry where there are tables where the decisions have been made what the best email address is, and it's been stored. And again, just an anecdotal thing, I don't know why, but the minute you progress to storing best copies of attributes, people that own the source data pay more attention in terms of governance. I don't know why.
Yeah, I think the other thing is that,
go ahead.
when I think of it, is these first three, registry, consolidated, coexistence, they're kind of building on each other. You're adding more MDM capability to support a slightly more sophisticated solution. So registry is just bare bones, use some kind of fuzzy matching to develop pointers. Consolidated is, hey, now let's take the data from those systems and decide what constitutes the best copy, attribute by attribute. coexistence is, hey, now let's take that and start sharing that best data back out to our operational systems. So those kind of three, you can think of like a slim consolidated is probably the closest thing there is to registry out there in the real world. But then additional systems and attributes might get added in as the next step. And then eventually you might start sharing that data back out to operational systems incrementally. So that's why we talk about this. It's not choose one style and stick with it. It's often a progression. The other thing I would say that's super important is that, and Bill alluded to this just in some engagements we had over the past week with customers, this is not well understood within organizations. And so, you know, and your job of selling MDM to leadership, do not underestimate the amount of confusion that may exist, particularly with your business stakeholders. When you talk about master data management with business stakeholders, they usually think one of two things. They think either, this is a tool for deduping, which is almost like a side effect, right? This is a tool for making sure your data is consistent and harmonized and well managed, which may include deduping. The other thing I see, and this is especially true of application owners, so people that are working with ERP or procurement tools or other business apps, they almost always think MDM is centralized and only centralized. And that's also not always the case. So this is a really good tool to use in the organization. We're happy to support you in this, but you need to get the stakeholders to have this aha moment that, hey, data management is not a one size fits all. It's actually, there's different approaches to achieve different results, and you need to be a little more nuanced in where to start.
Let me just answer a couple of questions that have come in. Do we have registry style? Yes. Our product, the Profisee platform, covers all of these. And just for clarity, in case it wasn't clear already, it's not, we don't cover it with separate products. It's one product that allows all of these implementation styles. And as we said, you can evolve from one to the other, and different use cases can engage the product in different ways, different domains. So lots of, so we cover all of this stuff. It's not separate things. And there's a couple of questions also around reference data. Bill, how does reference data fit into this? External or internal reference data? Should it be its own style or a separate focus area? How do you tend to look at that?
So there's actually a couple of questions here. The first one's really interesting because the reference data originates externally, which means you're not going to have control over the entry, really. The first thing I would do is ask a lot more questions about this if I were able to. But I would say, generally, think about whether it's the system of record more than where the data gets entered. If that's the only place it gets entered and you never change it, and that's the only place it's accessible from, you can certainly store it in MDM and consider it centralized. Again, I'd be concerned with how the updates actually are happening before I'd make that statement 100% definitively. But I think that's the important thing is, you know, what role is this playing, not where it's coming from. The second question I'll try to answer a little bit sideways. A lot of vendors, now we don't sell by domain at Profisee, so this matters less. But most other vendors consider reference data a domain. So honestly, you're going to have to buy a separate license to do that. There are some vendors that have packaged up a reference data domain or product. They all charge for it separately. Whereas for us, it would just be more records, probably a very low number, and more attributes, probably a very low number.
I think it's, you know, I look out there at the implementations that I see, even from my former roles at other companies, almost every initial use case, there's going to be some reference data that comes along for the ride. If I'm doing B2B customer, I'm going to have a state or province or country table that's technically reference data. What often will happen is, as a subsequent phase, people may address reference data in its own right, taking a more holistic approach to reference data. I think of one of our customers in a healthcare organization where she had the aha moment of, hey, with this platform, I can now put control and management over the hundreds of reference data tables that were supporting a lot of their analytics, right? And that was all being managed as shadow IT. So there were no consistent crosswalks or conversions or dimensions. And she had this aha moment of, hey, I've got a tool now where I can support that. It wasn't crystallized enough in the business. There wasn't a clear use case that would have justified starting with a reference data only approach. It's literally something that came along for the ride. So they're going to start with provider, but they're looking immediately to follow that on with, hey, let's take a holistic approach to reference data. So that's a really common
Actually,
experience.
if you're not going that way, I would suggest a pause. If you're not doing what Christopher said, if someone said we got to clean up our reference data, my next question would be why? Give me the reasons, because again, good example, hundreds of tables. You're not going to do that all at once. How are you going to decide? How are you going to prioritize? And already you've skipped the justification step, probably. If you came up with reference data as your initial concept, you probably skipped the justification, and you should go back again. That's a common pitfall. That's another way of saying I need to clean up all my customer data. Just more tables that are smaller.
Okay. One final question on this topic, and then we'll move on because we need to cover one more thing before we're done. People learn more about this, Bill. I'm assuming if they're a Gartner client, you can point them to something, and beyond that, what would you suggest?
Well, that would be the first thing. If you have access to Gartner research, I actually wrote a couple of research notes a few years ago. One was defining this, and then the second one is how to use these, as Christopher described, in sequences to achieve various business results. That's the best place because there's excruciating detail in there, and I worked really hard, and you should go read that. But we do this similar to BIR level stuff that Harbert does, and we'll get to that in a minute. We're definitely willing as part of pre-sales to go in and have this discussion, because it's we had two last week, like I said, that are literally, one fellow was on the call as soon as I just assumed everybody on the call knew this, and when he saw this, the first three words out of his mouth were, "This changes everything right here. This is exactly the problem we have." So again, it's important, and we're happy to support it to some depth as part of a pre-sales process.
Yeah, I think we do. Overall, we find that having this conversation, at minimum, this level sets everybody in the room, the customer's room. Some people may have one model in their head, somebody else may have another model, and you end up talking purposes for a lot of the conversation until you get this on the table and say, now, which exactly are we talking about? I find it very clarifying, and I think everyone else.
And oddly, the thing that drove us to this on Friday, was the support we have for metadata as a domain for a catalog, and that drove. I realized in the discussion the problem they were having grappling with that as a solution, as us being the solution, was they didn't understand this. And the minute the fellow saw it, he said, "Oh, this is how people do it."
Yeah. All right. Very good. Thank you. Get to our final topic before we run out of time, which is really around where to focus. Harbert, would you like to lead us off on that, and how this all kind of comes together within the BIR and ROI type of analysis? And I'll pop up your slide so you can talk through it.
I do. Let me take care of the. One second.
Yeah, that's quite a lot of echo, I think, on your line there, Harbert.
How's that now?
Oh, that's better.
Okay, perfect. Here's a kind of a decision framework we've used, and I think is really applicable and relevant to the MDM decision. And what you'll see is your bottom axis, your x-axis is your use case complexity. That gets a little bit of your cost and how long it's going to take. And on your y-axis on the left, you'll see kind of the value you're likely to get and the benefit. And what we see is it's really a kind of a trade-off between value and risk. And usually with the greater complexity, you're going to have a greater risk, and you're going to need to be more sophisticated, more skilled to be able to shoulder that risk and manage that risk. It's another reason we say start small. So what we see is that, if you have simple use cases and big value, that becomes somewhat of a no-brainer. Why wouldn't you want to do that? That's a good first place to focus. You get your quick win. You get to build credibility with the organization. As we talked a little bit earlier in a seminars of last week, it's also quick wins are really important for adoption and change management. It's another reason we talk about quick wins. But as you go and to understand and you've implemented and you prioritize, you know where you're going, you're probably going to want to focus first on what we're talking about, simple use cases with big benefits. But as you begin to evolve, and we're talking a little bit about the reference data approach, is this can really become a framework for innovation, thinking outside the box. And as you begin to mature within the MDM processes, you can begin to take on more risk, and kind of once you've got the low-hanging fruit, you can move forward and to bigger things, and kind of that think big part of what we've been talking about. And so this is also meant to be kind of as a way to focus on innovation. And as you begin to understand your business and how MDM fits into it and the different implementation styles, and you can really begin to innovate around a platform like Profisee. We've done some really interesting things with attribute data that, you begin to bring in, and you can feed different models, risk models, things like that, that on the surface, you don't necessarily think of as MDM. There really is a sweet spot in being able to use a use case and innovation and business model to improve a business outcome. So when you look at this, think about, what's complexity for you, how long, how many systems it touches, and that's really becomes kind of your proxy for risk. And then again, the benefit, oftentimes, we will start off with a beer and everyone will say, this is really painful for me. And, and it is painful, maybe something. For example, we've had people who haven't been able to bring in online catalogs from distributors. And so they have to hire people to kind of manage the catalogs because they don't have a system to do that. When you do kind of the value analysis, it might be, 40, 50 hours a month of heartache. I mean, it's painful, but that's likely not where the real value is. It doesn't mean you don't try to solve it. It might be that kind of box of the nice to have on the bottom left. So when we do analysis, we really try to look at the business outcome and the value. It doesn't mean it's not painful. There's a lot of painful things, but you have to understand where you're going to prioritize. And usually as you've implemented, you've done your use cases, you're succeeding, you get quick wins. A lot of the nice to haves can be done way faster than you could have done previously. And those pain points, can be done, kind of your checklist, get those out. But I really want to, once you've implemented and you're succeeding, you really, I think it's an opportunity to think outside the box and to innovate. And that's where, we like to use the beer as a way to kind of map out that process as a framework to think outside the box.
So a little point of clarification there, Harbert. So when you're going through this kind of analysis, each use case, I assume, would be plotted on this chart, on this 2x2. And so how many cases would you typically, be considering and rating and ranking next to each other?
We've done as few as 6, and we've done as many as, dozen and a half. So
that's 18
no
for
limit.
the rest of us, right?
Yeah, doesn't it? Yeah, absolutely.
Okay.
So there's really no set number that's right or wrong. The key is you have to prioritize. And we talked earlier also about justification. You don't want to use $1 million to solve a $100,000 problem. So really, this is kind of the decision point to be able to take prioritization and justification together as a way to make business decisions. The more you have, the more important this becomes. And we also talked earlier about it's not just what you do, it's also what you decide not to do. And that's where you kind of get in the wait and sees, where you don't want to boil the ocean. Sometimes you just need to put things in a parking lot and come back to it to see, what's the higher priority.
Excellent. That looks like the implementation styles conversation has generated quite a bit of questions. One, Bill, can you follow up on, I'm sure you've thought about this before, can we list all the factors like a decision tree to help us figure out which implementation style by domain?
That's an interesting question. My initial response is that I want to say I could have done a lot more programs if you could do something like this. We tried at Gartner for years to come up with some sort of, and I believe Gartner actually does have a decision matrix somewhere, but I don't think anybody really uses it, because in the end, it comes back to the approach that we've sort of been proposing this entire 2 weeks is, really stick to those outcomes, and use these architectures and styles in an orchestrated way to deliver those outcomes. That's the thing that really drives all of this. Now, if you show me a set of, I have been doing it long enough. Christopher's probably the same. Harvard on the business side as well. If you show me the outcome you want, I can tell you in about 10 minutes of discussion what's mixture of styles you want for what domains. But I would first ask you to build sort of a small from a number of attribute perspective data model. But the answer, unfortunately, is there really is, people have been thinking about this for a long time. One of the things that makes MDM challenging and data management in general is that there really isn't a checklist. It's largely situational. Again, if you drill it down 2 or 3 levels from where we are here, then we could start to tell you what the approach should be. And that's why consulting firms still make billions and billions a year in doing this stuff, sometimes without ever touching software.
Yeah, and following up to the situational idea, sometimes you might want one approach for a bidirectional synchronization, but some of your source systems just simply aren't capable of it. They can't accept data that way, and so you're limited, and you have to compromise and do a little bit of a hybrid, kind of a top-down. This would be our ideal model kind of thing. Usually stubs its toe quickly on what's the art of the possible in our situation today, is what I found. And
that's gotten better. You're absolutely right. That's gotten better. What I was sitting here thinking when you were saying that, I was thinking back to the year 2001, trying to talk to insurance industry operational system vendors and explaining to them what we wanted in terms of integrating to a hub that understood customer data. A lot of blank stares, a lot of, get out of my office kind of thing. But I think it's gotten somewhat better over the last 20 years, but you're right, absolutely.
Great. All right, we're close to the top of the hour. If anyone has a final question, drop it in the chat. But I think we have covered all the questions that came up, and hopefully what we've covered today has been helpful in terms of just thinking through where to start, how to define some of the initial scope. And I know that we said this before, but I'll say it just one more time. Understanding the implementation styles is tremendously clarifying, and having a conversation with internally about here are the different options, here's the practicality of it, here's what will mean in terms of effort and scope, and here's where we're going to start, here's where we think we might evolve. That's a conversation that becomes much easier when people have a conceptual understanding of what that what those different models are. Because if you leave it unsaid and people kind of have a different mental model, then it becomes the opposite of clarifying. It becomes very difficult to have a clear conversation. Okay, so I think we'll draw a line under this here. What's up tomorrow is evaluation pitfalls, and this ought to be interesting, I would hope, for the people on the call, because as a vendor we see lots of people doing evaluations, obviously, and sometimes it's pretty obvious who's on a good track to do a good evaluation that's going to end up with a good result, and it can be equally obvious when it is being led the wrong way. And I don't mean some kind of personal leadership thing, more that just your mental model for this may not be right, and even if you go through an extremely rigorous evaluation with the wrong mental model, you can end up with the wrong outcome. So hopefully we can impart a little bit of insight around that tomorrow, and we look forward to seeing you there. Thank you very much for your engagement today, and we look forward to seeing you tomorrow. Thank you.